A petite 1-year-old woman sits strapped to a chair in San Quentin's execution chamber, her heart thudding in her chest. It's a June morning in 1955, and Barbara Graham's pale face is lit by harsh fluorescent lights as witnesses watch from behind glass. She hears the prison phone ring and her breath catches. Could this be a last-minute reprieve from the governor? Moments later, the guard shakes his head. There will be no escape. The execution proceeds, and Barbara utters a final haunting statement. Good people are always so sure they're right. This is the last breath of a woman some called a cold-blooded killer, and others believed was an innocent victim of injustice. Would you have the strength to face death if you knew you might be innocent? Before we continue, if you enjoy in-depth true crime stories like this, please consider subscribing to our channel for more. Barbara Graham seemed, on the surface, like an ordinary young mother trying to get by in 1,950 seconds, California. She was attractive and petite, with soft brown curls and a hesitant smile in her mugshot, but behind that normal exterior lurked a tumultuous life. In 1953, Barbara was arrested for the brutal killing of 4-year-old widow Mabel Monahan in Burbank, California. Along with 2 male accomplices, she was accused of invading Mabel's home, tying her up, and savagely beating her while hunting for a rumored fortune in cash. The crime shocked the state, not only for its merciless violence against an elderly woman, but also because a woman, Barbara, was among the perpetrators. The case quickly became notorious nationwide. Nicknamed Bloody Babs by the press, Barbara Graham's story made headlines as she became one of the very few women ever sentenced to die in California. At that time, the state had executed only 2 women in its history. A female death row inmate was virtually unheard of. Was this young mother truly a mastermind of murder? Or had she been dragged into a deadly scheme by ruthless criminals? The stakes were as high as they come. Barbara's fate would ignite debate about justice, mercy, and whether the system had condemned an innocent. What drove Barbara to take part in such a heinous act? And did she really deserve the ultimate punishment? In this story, we'll unravel the truth behind California's most controversial execution. It was a chilly spring night on the 9th of March, 1953. Inside a modest ranch-style house on Parkside Avenue in Burbank, California, 4-year-old Mabel Monahan settled in for the evening. Mabel was a widowed grandmother with a slight limp from an old injury. Known in her younger years as a vaudeville performer and palm reader, she lived alone but was cautious and kept her doors locked. Rumors around town whispered that Mabel's former son-in-law, a Las Vegas gambling figure, had hidden a small fortune in her home safe. That gossip had caught the ears of some desperate criminals. As Mabel relaxed in her quiet living room, she had no idea that a crew of thieves was about to shatter the peace of her home. Late that night, a knock came at Mabel's front door. Peering out, she saw a petite young woman, looking distressed and alone. It was Barbara Graham. Barbara told Mabel that her car had broken down nearby and asked if she could use the phone. Mabel was wary of strangers, especially of men at night, but a stranded woman seemed harmless. Concerned, Mabel unlatched the door to help. The moment the door cracked open, 2 men burst out of the shadows and forced their way inside behind Barbara. In seconds, the quiet house was thrown into chaos. The intruders were Barbara's criminal associates, Jack Santo and Emmett the Weasel Perkins, both hardened criminals in search of the rumored safe, supposedly stuffed with cash. Mabel cried out in alarm as the men shoved her against a wall. Desperate to silence the panicked widow, Barbara allegedly lifted her pistol and struck Mabel hard across the head with its heavy butt. The blow stunned Mabel, who collapsed to the floor moaning. The intruders then pinned the terrified woman down. They tied Mabel's wrists behind her back with rough cord and stuffed a cloth gag into her mouth. The gang demanded to know where the money was hidden, but there was no safe. Mabel pleaded, or tried to through the gag, that she had no hidden cash, only her modest belongings. Refusing to believe her, Perkins and Santo ransacked the house, overturning drawers, ripping apart couch cushions, searching frantically for non-existent loot. As the intruders tore the place apart, Mabel Monahan lay bound on the floor, bleeding and gasping for air through the gag. At some point, one of the attackers slipped a pillowcase over Mabel's head, while another tightened a piece of cloth around her neck to keep her quiet. In those brutal moments, the elderly woman slowly suffocated, unable to scream or breathe properly. After turning the home upside down and finding nothing of value, the robbers finally gave up. Before fleeing, they left Mabel helpless on the floor, her head covered and her body bruised. Barbara and the men rushed out into the dark night, disappearing as quickly as they had come. They had achieved nothing, no money, no jewelry, only a senseless act of violence. For nearly 2 days, no one realized what had happened inside the Monohan house. Mabel's neighbors eventually grew concerned. Lights had been left on, and newspapers were piling up on the porch. It wasn't until her gardener arrived and peered through a window that the awful scene was discovered. The living room was a wreck. Furniture toppled, papers strewn about, and stains of blood on the carpet leading down the hallway. Mabel's lifeless body was found partially inside a hall closet, still bound and gagged. She had been bludgeoned and asphyxiated. The gentle widow who loved her rose garden and doted on her grandchildren had died alone and terrified. News of the horrific murder spread quickly, striking fear and outrage throughout Southern California. Who could have committed such a callous crime against a defenseless older woman? And was one of the culprits really a woman herself? Police knew they were dealing with a uniquely chilling case. A home invasion turned fatal, possibly involving a female accomplice. The hunt for Mabel Monohan's killers was about to begin. How did Barbara Graham come to be involved in such a crime? The answers lie in her troubled past. Barbara's life began under difficult circumstances. She was born in Oakland in 1923 to a teenage mother who was unwed and unable to care for a baby. As a child, Barbara was bounced between foster homes and even spent time in an orphanage. By age 14, she was sent to a reform school, the same brutal institution her mother had passed through years before. The experience was harsh and traumatic. Barbara emerged at 16, hardened and craving love and stability. She attempted a normal life, marrying very young and having a son while still a teen. But that marriage quickly fell apart. Over the next few years, Barbara married and divorced several times, giving birth to 2 more sons along the way. Sadly, she couldn't provide a stable home. Her children ended up being raised by relatives or placed in foster care, as her life spiraled out of control. By the early 1952s, Barbara was adrift and living on the fringes of society. To survive, she turned to vice and crime. She worked for a time as a waitress and even as a hospital aide. But soon she found quicker money in the underworld. Barbara became involved in prostitution and hung around illegal gambling parlors in California. She picked up a narcotics habit, heroin, and accumulated a rap sheet of minor offenses: forging checks, committing perjury, prostitution arrests, and the like. Though none of these were violent crimes, they showed her willingness to break the law and her struggle to survive by any means necessary. She also had a knack for falling in with bad company. In 1953, she married her 4th husband, Henry Graham, a bartender and drug addict who introduced her to even seedier characters. Through Henry, Barbara befriended Emmett Perkins, a career criminal tied to Los Angeles' mob scene, and his partner Jack Santo. Barbara, who had always bristled at conventional rules, was now fully embedded in a dangerous crowd. Psychologically, Barbara Graham was a product of years of neglect and hard knocks. Those who knew her described 2 sides to Barbara. One side was vivacious, fun-loving, and starved for affection. She enjoyed jazz music, partying, and dreamed of finding real love in a better life. The other side was jaded and reckless. She had been let down by so many people that she learned not to trust anyone. Barbara often acted tough and independent, hiding her insecurities behind a facade of glamour, sharp wit, and defiance. She didn't fit the 1952nd stereotype of a demure, law-abiding woman at all. She lived fast and on the edge. By the time she became involved with Perkins and Santo, Barbara was willing to take risky bets and skirt the law without hesitation. Perhaps she thought joining their scheme to rob someone would finally be her ticket to some easy money. Or maybe, after a life of hardship, she felt she had no way out of the criminal world she knew. Whatever her mindset, Barbara's troubled past set the stage for the tragedy to come. All the wrong turns and bitter experiences had led her to March 1953, and the deadly night that would forever change her fate. When Mabel Monahan's body was discovered in her ransacked home, the Burbank police launched a high-priority investigation. They quickly surmised that it was a robbery-turned-murder likely committed by experienced criminals. One clue was unusual. Neighbors remembered that Mabel had opened the door to a young woman on the night of the crime. This suggested that a female accomplice helped the killers gain entry. Detectives chased down leads in the Los Angeles underworld, where whispers of a $100,000 stash in Mabel's house had been circulating. A break came when a known safecracker named Baxter Shorter was picked up by police a few weeks later on unrelated charges. Facing pressure and hoping for leniency, Shorter confessed that he had been involved in the Monahan robbery. He named his partners Emmett Perkins, Jack Santo, John True, and a woman, Barbara Graham. Before police could fully secure Shorter's testimony, he vanished. Underworld gossip hinted that Perkins had gotten wind of Shorter's betrayal. According to one witness, Perkins kidnapped Shorter at gunpoint, and Shorter was never seen again. He was presumed murdered to ensure his silence. With their potential star witness gone, authorities moved fast to round up the remaining suspects. In May 1953, Barbara Graham, Jack Santo, and Emmett Perkins were tracked down and arrested. Their capture was dramatic and made headlines, largely because of Barbara's involvement. The idea of a 9-year-old mother being part of such a vicious crime fascinated and horrified the public in equal measure. As photographers snapped her mugshot, Barbara maintained a defiant stare and insisted she was innocent, claiming she wasn't even at the scene of Mabel's murder. Investigators, however, were not convinced. To strengthen their case, the police flipped one of the conspirators. John True, sensing the walls closing in, agreed to cooperate and testify for the state in exchange for immunity. True's statements placed Barbara squarely at the crime scene. He claimed she had been the one to knock on Mabel's door and lure her into opening it, and even asserted that Barbara struck the victim during the attack. Still, prosecutors knew that a jury might doubt the word of a criminal accomplice alone, especially since there was no physical evidence, no fingerprints or DNA, directly tying Barbara to the murder. So they devised an elaborate sting operation to get more proof. While Barbara awaited trial in county jail, an inmate named Donna Prow cozied up to her. Prow, unbeknownst to Barbara, was acting as a police informant. She befriended Barbara, offering sympathy and support. And Barbara, lonely and afraid, believed she had found a friend. Prow then introduced Barbara to a friend outside the jail who, she claimed, could provide a false alibi to help beat the charges. Desperate for any chance to save herself, Barbara agreed to this plan. The supposed alibi witness was, in reality, an undercover detective. In a secretly recorded conversation, Barbara was caught on tape, essentially admitting that she had been with her co-defendants on the night of the murder and discussing how to lie about it. It wasn't a direct confession to killing Mabel, but it showed that Barbara knew details of the crime and was attempting to fabricate an alibi, strong evidence of consciousness of guilt. With that, the investigators had what they needed. By the time Barbara Graham's trial neared, the police and prosecutors had assembled a case that included an eyewitness turned informant, John True, and Barbara's own recorded words. The discovery phase was effectively over, and authorities were confident that they could prove Barbara's involvement in the heinous crime. All that remained was to present the evidence in court and let a jury decide her fate. The trial of Barbara Graham, along with Emmett Perkins and Jack Santo, opened in Los Angeles in late 1953 to intense public interest. Prosecutor J. Miller Levy painted Barbara as a cold-blooded gun moll who willingly assisted in a brutal murder. He dramatically recounted for the jury how the trio invaded Mabel Monahan's home and emphasized that Barbara herself had tricked the victim and even tied and pistol-whipped the helpless widow. The idea of a woman committing such violence made headlines, and Levy played it up, calling Barbara the bait that turned a robbery into a killing. Barbara's defense attorney, Jack Hardy, faced an uphill battle. He argued that the case against her was built on unreliable witnesses and the prosecution's desire for a conviction at any cost. He reminded the jury that no physical evidence linked Barbara to the crime, nothing but the words of her criminal associates, who had everything to gain by blaming her. Hardy cast Barbara as a scapegoat. He claimed she wasn't even present at the murder, urging jurors to question the motives of men like John True, who had cut a deal and might be lying to save his own skin. The defense emphasized Barbara's status as a mother and suggested that it made no sense for her to commit such a monstrous act. The prosecution's rebuttal was powerful. John True took the stand and delivered a damning account of the crime. He testified that Barbara was indeed the one who knocked on Mabel's door that night, and that once inside he saw Barbara strike the elderly woman during the struggle. Barbara sat at the defense table, watching True in disbelief and shaking her head no as he spoke. But the damage was done. Next, prosecutors unveiled the secret weapon they had engineered: the undercover tape recording. The courtroom listened to Barbara's own voice, caught on tape, as she discussed creating a fake alibi. In the recording, Barbara essentially acknowledged being with her co-defendants on the night of the murder and was heard trying to fabricate a story to mislead investigators. This evidence hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt. Any doubts the jurors might have harbored about Barbara's involvement evaporated as they heard her calmly plotting to avoid punishment. After several weeks of testimony and arguments, the jury began deliberations. It didn't take them long. They returned with their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder for Barbara Graham, and for Perkins and Santo as well. The conviction meant an automatic sentence of death. When Barbara heard the word guilty ring out in the silent courtroom, her composure finally shattered. She gasped and began to sob uncontrollably. In an anguished outburst, 9-year-old Barbara stood up and pleaded with the courtroom, insisting she was innocent. "I swear to God, I am innocent of this crime," she cried. In a moment that stunned everyone, she even invoked her little son, screaming, "If I did it, I hope my baby drops dead." The raw pain and desperation in her voice cast a brief hush over the spectators. Even some who were convinced of her guilt felt a pang of sorrow at the scene. But the verdict was final. The judge formally pronounced the death sentence for Barbara Graham, to be carried out in the gas chamber. Outside the courthouse, public reaction to the verdict was mixed. Many onlookers felt justice had been served. A cruel murderer, even if she was a woman, would face the ultimate penalty: providing justice for Mabel Monahan. The press ran triumphant headlines calling her the beautiful killer, who would be California's next woman to die. However, a quieter minority had misgivings. Some journalists and citizens wondered if the evidence, largely circumstantial and dependent on criminals' testimony and a sting operation, was truly beyond a reasonable doubt. They questioned whether gender bias and sensationalism had influenced the outcome. These doubts, however, did nothing to change Barbara's fate. She was whisked off to prison to await execution, becoming only the third woman ever sent to California's death row. As Barbara Graham traded her stylish courtroom dresses for a prison uniform, she continued to proclaim that she had not killed anyone. The legal battle was over. But the final chapter of Barbara's story, her slow march toward the gas chamber, was just beginning. After the verdict, Barbara Graham's lawyers immediately began the long process of appeals. But one by one, those efforts failed. Through 1,954 and into 1,955, her case was reviewed by higher courts. The California Supreme Court upheld her conviction, and the U.S. Supreme Court declined to intervene. Despite the questions that some raised about the fairness of her trial, nothing changed in the legal arena. Barbara's death sentence stood. Outside the courtroom, a few voices spoke up in her defense. Prominent San Francisco reporter Edward S. Montgomery, who had covered the trial, became convinced that Barbara had not received a fair shake. In articles, he pointed out inconsistencies and the lack of concrete evidence tying her to murder. He and other death penalty opponents petitioned Governor Goodwin Knight for clemency. They argued that executing a woman based largely on circumstantial evidence and testimony from dubious witnesses would be a tragic mistake. Was society executing a truly guilty killer, or a woman who might have merely been present at the crime. These pleas, however, met stiff resistance. Governor Knight, facing a public with little sympathy for murderous women, showed no inclination to spare Barbara Graham. He was under political pressure to be tough on crime and saw little reason to override the courts. As the execution date neared, Barbara's behavior in prison was described by guards as subdued and polite. Gone was the brash Bloody Babs caricature. In her place was a quiet, reflective inmate. She continued to maintain that she never killed anyone. Barbara spent her days at the California Institution for Women in Corona, reading her Bible, working in the prison laundry, and writing letters. In one letter to a relative, she expressed heartbreak that she would never see her children grow up. Her toddler son, Tommy, had been placed with adoptive guardians, and her older boys remained with their fathers or other family. Barbara faced the reality that she would likely go to her death with the world believing she was a murderer. Still, she held out a slender hope that something or someone might intervene at the last moment. By late May 1955, all of Barbara's legal appeals were exhausted, and the execution date was officially set for the 3rd of June 1955. She was transferred to San Quentin State Prison for her final 24 hours, since that is where California's gas chamber resided. In the days leading up to this, a small group of supporters held vigils and continued writing to the governor, but to no avail. On the eve of her execution, Barbara reportedly slept little. She met with a priest, Father McAllister, who later said she was profoundly afraid but trying to keep her dignity. June 3rd dawned gray and cool over San Francisco Bay. Barbara dressed in simple prison clothes and prepared herself to die. Yet even on that last morning, fate played a few cruel tricks. As the scheduled hour arrived, Barbara Graham would face a final gauntlet of emotional torment, a few more twists in the story before it was all over. On the morning of the 3rd of June 1955, Barbara Graham's final hour arrived at San Quentin. She was scheduled to die at 10 a.m., and guards led her from her cell toward the prison's cyanide gas chamber. At the last minute, just as she was about to be strapped into the chair, the telephone rang. An urgent call from the governor's office had brought a temporary stay of execution. Barbara's heart leapt with hope, but only minutes later the stay was lifted. Then, incredibly, a second brief reprieve came through, only to be revoked moments afterward. This cruel back and forth was unbearable. Barbara broke down in tears, crying, "Why do they torture me like this?" as she was escorted in and out of the chamber. Finally, shortly before 11 a.m., the warden received a final message. There would be no more delays. The execution was to proceed. Shaking uncontrollably, Barbara was helped into the metal chair inside the chamber. Dozens of witnesses watched from behind a glass window. Unable to face their eyes on her, Barbara made a last request for a blindfold. A matron slipped a black sleep mask over her eyes. She was strapped down with belts across her lap and chest. The warden quietly asked for her last words. Barbara took a breath and uttered, "Good people are always so sure they're right." A moment later, the chamber was sealed shut. The executioner released cyanide pellets into a vat of acid beneath Barbara's chair, unleashing a cloud of poisonous gas. Barbara inhaled, and her body jerked against the restraints. Mercifully, she quickly lost consciousness. At 11:12 a.m., after a doctor checked her pulse, Barbara Graham was pronounced dead. There was no celebration. Prison officials noted the time and removed Barbara's body for a quick, quiet burial. She was laid to rest at a cemetery with only a handful of people in attendance. However, Barbara's story did not end with her death. Her case immediately became part of California lore. Many newspapers ran headlines about the rare execution of a woman, questioning whether justice had truly been served. A few years later, Hollywood turned her story into an acclaimed film, I Want to Live, 1958, which portrayed Barbara sympathetically and intensified the debate over her guilt and the death penalty. To some, Barbara Graham remains a cold-blooded murderer who got what she deserved. To others, her life and death stand as a tragic example of how the truth can die alongside the accused. Either way, The final chapter of Barbara's life, her last words and her last breath in that gas chamber, left an indelible mark on those who witnessed it and on the pages of American legal history. Barbara Graham's journey from a neglected childhood to a notorious end on death row raises enduring questions about crime and punishment. Was she a calculating killer who willingly helped murder an innocent woman? Or was she herself a victim, shaped by abuse, misfortune, and the schemes of others, ultimately paying the price for a crime she may not have committed? Decades later, her case remains a haunting example whenever people debate capital punishment. Some see Barbara's execution as justice served, proof that no one, not even a mother of three, is above the law. Others view her story as a cautionary tale of how a flawed system can doom someone who might have been saved or rehabilitated, or perhaps was even innocent of the worst charges. In the end, we are left with a profound and unanswerable question. Was justice truly served in the case of Barbara Graham? Or was she yet another tragic figure crushed by circumstance and a thirst for retribution? Was she, in her final moments, a murderer receiving her due punishment, or a broken woman whom life and the law had failed? We invite you to reflect on this and share your thoughts. Was Barbara Graham a monster who got what was coming to her, or a victim of a fate she didn't fully deserve? Let us know in the comments, and if this story moved or intrigued you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth true crime stories. Sometimes the darkest true stories force us to confront what justice really means. Thank you for watching,